Once you have the Reimagined plugin installed, open Adobe Photoshop CC 2021 or any future version of Photoshop. And when you do, you may see a free floating panel with the plugin as you see it right now on my screen. If you don't, simply come up to the word Plugins, down to Reimagined V1, over to Reimagine and click it, and that will open up a panel with the plugin inside. Now, this is a free floating panel, so it can be docked to any workspace toolbar in your workspace for Photoshop. Once it's docked, it will be represented by the letter R. If you click it, that will open up the panel with the plugin inside. I want to go through the fundamentals of what this plugin is about, its workflow, and then we'll actually use it to create some artwork on top of this image of my wonderful friend Kiara. The three core fundamentals to digital photo editing in Photoshop, to me, are color, luminosity, and detail. Those are the three main elements that you can call to when you ask yourself the question, what do I do with this image now? Where do I go? What's the next step? Are there colors in the scene that are too strong, not strong enough? Are they pulling focus? Do we need to work with them to drive the audience's focus to the subject of our image? Are there luminosity values? Is it too bright? Is it too dark? Are the white and black points of the scene off? Do we need to work with those to yet again pull the audience's focus to the subject of our image? Are there details that need to become stronger and sharpened? Are there details that need to be blurred out? Are there things that we can do to yet again pull the audience's focus to the subject of our image? Those are the three core principles that I have always used in my artwork over the past 20 years. And that's why I built the plugin. I wanted people to be able to have access not only to the color grading and styles that I've used with Reality Reimagined for a number of years, but ultimately to follow that workflow so that you can always be able to create your best artwork or get that leaping off point. And using this specific numerical workflow in the plugin will help you do precisely that. And this is sort of centered and geared toward the beginner user of Photoshop. I wanted them to feel supported to be able to create the artwork. So when they sit down for the first time and say, I want to master this program, I want to create artwork, this plugin can be that tool or companion on that art journey. So let's get started and create our first style. If you mouse over any one of these four buttons, these four styles come with version 1 of the Reimagined plugin. There are new styles being created and will be available soon to add into the plugin at a later time. If you mouse over them, it's going to give you a description of what the color grade will do and what to expect. Now, before we click one of these, I want to talk about presets. If you've ever used presets or seen them used in programs like Lightroom or Photoshop, these presets do a lot of work to the image in various ways to create that stylized look. And the problem with presets is that they very rarely work with all images. Sometimes they work beautifully with one image and they just won't work with another image because it's not strong enough, it's too strong. And the only way to really control that is to simply reduce the opacity of the preset. Now you can use the other tools in Lightroom or Photoshop to add on top of the preset to try to rescue the image or to add further to it. But ultimately that preset, that one stylized look, can only be controlled by opacity. But with the Reimagined plugin, you have more control. So I'm going to click style number 1. It's going to make a folder with 2 identical layers inside of it. And this is part of the power of the plugin itself. These 2 layers, both under the folder of style 1 color, one says style 1 color, the other one says style 1 luminosity. These are the 2 independent functions of this very stylized look that is created with the plugin. So if the colors are too strong, you can make sure that the color layer is selected and then come up to opacity and just reduce it just a bit to get some of that color out of the scene. Or if the luminosity changes to the image that were caused by this color grade are too powerful, you can come to the layer that's represented by luminosity and reduce the opacity and bring it down. This gives you a level of control of this color grading that you can use this style in its full power or reduce some of the opacity on those 2 independent layers to be able to really fine tune it to your specific imagery. Now let's go on and try the other styles. So I'm going to click style number 2. It's going to delete that first folder that was created, make a new folder named style 2 color. It'll have 2 identical layers, one for color, one for luminosity. So you can test and see what the colors are. Again, if the colors are too strong, simply come to the layer for color, reduce the opacity, and get that effect lessened just a touch. If the overall luminosity changes that happened because of the color grade are too powerful, reduce this opacity of this layer just a touch as well. Let's go on to Style 3. If we click it, it deletes Style 2's folder, creates a new folder for Style 3 color, the two identical layers. You have the same controls as you did before. And then Style 4 creates that final look. And these are the 4 artistic looks that I have used in all of my artwork for Reality Reimagined for 10 plus years. So once you've picked a style and you like the color grade, I'm going to go back to, let's say, Style 1. That's kind of my favorite right now, but I like all 4 of them. So once we have the folder, and we've addressed the numerical workflow of step number 1 for color, let's come down to the second section for luminosity. The first control we have in this fundamental is adding more of an additional matte to the color grade. So we can add it into an intensity effect of either light, even, or heavy. I'm going to go ahead and click light. It's going to make that adjustment layer that adds more additional matte to the scene. If I want more matte into it, I can click even or heavy, and it will change that value of this one adjustment layer to be able to add more of that overall effect. If you want to find some sort of sweet spot, if you will, between 2 of these, then simply just reduce the opacity of the layer as we did with the 2 different layers in the color grade. Then going into the next section of this fundamental for contrast, when you add the matte effect to an image, it can often wreak havoc to the black point in the scene and the overall brightness of it, and can change that. So this contrast option attempts to overcome that. And again, it has different intensity settings by light, even, and heavy. So I'm going to go ahead and click light. It will make that adjustment layer that adds a little bit more contrast to the black point within the scene and a little bit more brightness to it. If you want that effect to be lessened just a little bit, reduce the opacity of the adjustment layer. Now moving into the final numerical step of the workflow of the Reimagined plugin is details. And the first section of this is a general pass to sharpen the entire image. I'm going to go ahead and click the intensity value of low. And again, this is across the entire scene. So it makes everything intense in that sharpening across the entire scene. If you only want that in certain key areas, then you can utilize the layer mask that comes with it. Now this is a white mask or a reveal all. So the entire layer of sharpening is being revealed and is visible in the document. But if you only want it in certain key areas, regardless of the intensity value that you choose, then you can do a couple of things. You can either paint black onto this white mask, and wherever you paint black, it will begin to hide the effect. So you can paint it everywhere in the scene where you don't want the sharpening and just leave the white mask intact where you do want the sharpening. Or, while the layer mask is selected inside of Photoshop, you can hit Control or Command and the letter I for invert. That will invert the white mask to a black mask or a hide all mask, and then paint white onto the mask to begin to reveal the sharpening in the key areas where you want it to be. Now, it's my recommendation, and again, this is just my artistic workflow and style, to leave the mask as a white mask and leave it intact. Don't paint any black onto the mask. Choose the intensity that you want of this sharpening to the scene, because going back to those fundamentals, color, luminosity, and detail, getting a general sharpening to the image is always a valuable thing, in my opinion. The next step in this section of the workflow for the Reimagined panel is a final sharpen. This is where you can do really strategic, careful sharpening to the scene to again drive the audience's focus to the subject. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the intensity of low for final sharpen. It's going to create that layer for sharpening, but it's going to create a black mask by default. So the entire look is being hidden. And then we would paint white onto that mask to reveal it wherever we need it to be. So in this case, when I'm doing an image that has a human subject in it, I often will do this final step of sharpening on their eyes, their nose, and their lips and mouth, so that we can drive the audience's focus by that subtle little detail to their face, to the subject in my scene. But if you're a landscape photographer, a product photographer, other genres where you want more intense details in certain areas, you have that layer mask to work with. You can invert the mask to white and reveal it everywhere, and paint with black to take it away in the areas where you don't want it to be. The choice is yours, and that's what I wanted you to have the freedom to do with this plugin, creating the overall styles. Now, with each one of these numerical steps in the workflow addressed, we have our look, and this is the style for this image. So at this stage, we could flatten the image and save it and move on to the next piece of artwork. But let's explore the rest of the buttons in the bottom of the plugin, and then we'll go through a couple of things to make sure you look out for as you use this plugin. So at the bottom of the plugin, we have a button that says Protect Skin Tones. This is going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer that simply reduces the colors red, orange, and yellow just a little bit. Now, regardless of your ethnicity, every human being on Earth has red, orange, and yellow in their skin tone. This reduces it across the entire scene just a touch. So in this case, Kiara has red hair and she's wearing a red shirt. Some of that color is being reduced. So this is a white mask, a reveal all. If I don't want it to be on her hair or her shirt, I would simply paint black onto this mask in those areas to remove the effect. But most of the time, it's just a general lessening of those colors and isn't too egregious anywhere else in the image except the skin tones. The last two buttons in the plugin, Image Dock, you can duplicate your image. Now, I suggest you use this button before you do any of the workflow of the plugin itself, because it's going to duplicate your base image. And what do I mean by that? It's going to create a second document. Right now, we have one document opened in Photoshop, which is called Reimagined. If I click Duplicate, it's going to open a second document labeled whatever the original name is and 1. And then you can make 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and 6, and so forth, and go as far as you want. Making these additional duplicate documents gives you the ability to build different looks with the same image and bounce back and forth between them to get a visual representation of each one to select the look you're going after. So that button will give you that option to create those different documents. The last button, Revert. This is a very important button, so open your ears and make sure you pay attention to this part. If you click Revert, it is going to return the image to its original state when it was opened in Photoshop in the first place. So let me explain why this is very important. It returns this image to its original state when it was opened in the first place in Photoshop. If I opened this raw image of Kiara, processed it through Adobe Camera Raw, spent an hour doing a full retouch to the image, and then added some other layers and so forth, and then decided to use the Reimagined plugin. And then I say, you know, I don't like all the layers that I chose for this look. I want to revert it. When I click Revert, it will not only delete all the layers you just created with the Reimagined plugin, but it will return the image to its original state when it was opened, which means all of that work I did for retouching, all the additional things I did to the artwork before I used the plugin, all of that will be lost. So before you click this button, I strongly urge you to save your image, so you have a backup of your image at that state before you start using the plugin. And just as a general tip and note, this is a best practice no matter what you do in Photoshop. I often save as I go. So as I'm working on an image and I start retouching it, once the retouch is complete and I like the way that it looks, I save a version of the image, usually labeled Kiara Retouch 1. And then I move into the color grading. I'll save a version of that that says Kiara Color Grade and Retouch so that I know what's been done to the image as I'm working. So make sure you save your work before you click the Revert button. But the Revert button is a way to take you back to the very beginning of the image before you've done anything with the panel or the plugin itself. Now at the bottom, you see the Reality Reimagined logo. If you mouse over it, it will take you to this YouTube channel where you can find these videos on how to use the panel and best practices, but also all the other tutorials that are available for Photoshop and photography education on the channel. If you come up to the top and mouse over Reimagine, it turns purple. If you click it, it will pull up an About box that explains a little bit about the panel and also has a link to my website. This is key, because if you need to contact me for any kind of questions, recommendations, suggestions, simply go to the website and click the Contact tab and send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. To close this window, simply click Close. Now, if something goes awry with this floating panel in Photoshop and it gets all weird, then simply navigate up to the hamburger and click it. This is where you can also find the About section if you wish, but then come down to Reload Panel, and it will reload this panel with the plugin inside in case something goes awry. So the final thing that I want to point out is the workflow itself and my recommendation to stay in this workflow. Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3 of those fundamentals. And if you want to return to Step 1, I suggest you revert and go back to the very beginning, and let me explain why. If I choose style number 1, and it creates those two different layers that we have control over in that one folder group, then I come down and let's say I choose light for matte, light for contrast, a low intensity setting for the general pass, and then a low intensity setting for the final sharpen. And I have all of my layers that creates this look. And now I decide, you know what? I don't like style 1. I don't like this color grade. I want to go to style 2. If I click style 2, the way the coding works for this plugin, it's going to cause a little bit of a problem, and I want to explain why it's there. So if I click style 2, it will delete the folder of style 1, and it will make a new folder of style 2, and unfortunately it has to go at the top of our layer stack. That isn't the end of the world. The problem is this one step that we did here in the final sharpening, this is based upon the look of style 1. It cannot change this layer. So if we were to have these details and manually move the folder stack down to the bottom in our layers, we still have this layer that's based upon the old look. So I do recommend that you use the revert button to go back to the original state of the image and then start again. The reason why this is there is because as this was being developed, we wanted to make sure that every user had the ability to use any of the buttons at any time and not be forced to go through the numerical sequence. Why? Because I wanted this plugin again to be centered and designed for beginners to use it. Because as beginners are stepping into their first stages, their first times working in Photoshop, if they have an image that they already like the colors, they already like the color grade, or they have a preset that they like to use, but they like the sharpening or the matte or the contrast that's created by the Reimagined plugin, I wanted them to have access to those buttons so they could do this. So no color grade, we can skip step 1 and just simply come down to matte and create a matte effect, add some contrast to it, then add a sharpening if we wish, skip the final sharpen if we want to, and then do some of our own work on top of it to create a completely different color grade or other options, other tools inside of Photoshop. And those possibilities are limitless. But again, I wanted the beginner user of Photoshop to have access to these controls because I remember what it was like 20 plus years ago when I sat down and went, what was that thing, that button, that thing that did the matte contrast sharpening doohickey thingy? What was that again? Because I can't remember. I wanted you to have the buttons to be able to do that. So if you build a workflow and you want to go back, please use the revert button. Make sure your image is saved. Use the revert button and start again at step 1 in the workflow with working with color. That's the plugin itself. That's the general purpose of all of this. There will be future videos in this series showing you different things you can do outside of the basic style that you create, other tools in Photoshop to explore using to add to your own artwork and flow. If you have any questions, please go to the Reality Reimagined website by going to realityreimagined.com, use the contact tab, and send me an email. If you have suggestions, if you have questions, if you have troubles, send me that information and I will get to you as soon as possible. I'm so excited for you to go on this journey. Thank you again for purchasing this plugin. And until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.